Congress, and that amount cannot adjust during your actual term in office. Okay. So let's go ahead and go through here, and we're going to do some analytical stuff here. There's going to be a few situations where I'm not going to go into a lot of analytical discussion about it, because my perspective here is to give you the general insight about what these amendments are about. But in terms of certain aspects of them, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I may acknowledge that something is controversial, but I'm not going to go much deeper than that, because it's not my place to kind of discuss, which side is best or which perspective is best on a lot of these. And it's really going to come down to your own interpretation. My job is to facilitate, your understanding of the basics of what these mean. And then beyond that, you can do your own investigation and your own digging. So can I get somebody to read Article 1, please, or the First Amendment? Sinead, go ahead.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
Thank you. So a lot of historians refer to this as the paramount amendment, meaning of the greatest importance. And I think that most Americans would agree, because it's the Freedoms Amendment. It lays out the 5 freedoms: religion, press, assembly, petition, and speech. And there's a lot here that, obviously, if you're talking about circumstances of Supreme Court cases, I would say that a good portion, if not the majority, of Supreme Court cases throughout history have referenced something in the First Amendment, in some case, in terms of what their decision is. Okay. You also have the understanding or the idea of expression, freedom of expression underneath freedom of speech. If we do have time, we'll look at a classic Supreme Court case involving school expression at school. The case is called Tinker versus Des Moines, and it's about students who were peaceably protesting the Vietnam War and were suspended from school for that, and took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, which it's one of those they call them landmark cases that have been used countless times in referencing decisions, and those that made tremendous headlines and history in the moment. But obviously we hear a lot about speech and religion and press, right of peaceful assembly. If you see somebody on the courthouse square, holding up an anti-war sign, peaceful assembly. The one that's often overlooked that at that time was probably as important as any, was the last one, the petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is something that happened numerous times during the colonial period, where the colonies felt that they were concerned about a circumstance happening with Britain. They sent a petition to the king that had grievances, and the king refused to acknowledge them. And it's something that we saw during the Declaration of Independence, where it basically was like, well, we got into the point here. The reason why we're here is that our grievances and concerns were being ignored by the king. And they list that whole section of grievances in the document. So the belief that you have the right to address a concern with the government and should be expecting to have a response is the petition part. And that's as much of a big part of the First Amendment as any of them. Okay. Let's go to Article 2. Can I get a reader, please, for Article 2? Chris.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Okay, thank you. I think this is probably the one amendment that is the most controversial in terms of where people stand on it. You have people that are very much against it, very much for it, and some people kind of fall in the middle here. Okay. I'm not really going to go into much more detail than that, because this is one of those amendments that I tend to kind of steer clear of because of the political nature surrounding it. Obviously, I'm sure you and your family have opinions on this, and that's perfectly fine, regardless of what the opinion is. Either way, But this one, I would say, is as important to some people as the First Amendment in many ways, and they express that very clearly today. So let's go to the Third Amendment. Can I get a reader, please? Alex.
No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law.
Okay, thank you. I think that of all the amendments we have, this is the one that's probably the most irrelevant. It also kind of shows you the age of the document. By the way, we have the oldest constitution used in the world, with the exception of San Marino, which is a small state in Italy that uses a centuries-old document. But this is one I think that when we look at it, we're like, yeah, that kind of tells us the age, because obviously this was an ongoing issue during the American Revolution. You had the troops being quartered in people's homes without their consent numerous times before the war started, the American Revolutionary War started. And it became such a concern in the future that citizens wanted to make this expressively clear in the amendments. And honestly, this is one amendment that I can't recall in any circumstance having been referenced in a Supreme Court case, just because it's so unique in what it's saying. It would only be something in a very specific circumstance where I could even imagine it being referenced. Cassidy?
The United States is relatively a newer country compared to like countries like Scotland and in England.
Yes.
Well, why is our Constitution one of the oldest when we've only been around for like 200 years?
Sure. And what that means is that other developed, established countries have gone through a process of completely revamping and rewriting their government document. Canada has the Charters of Freedom. I mean, you obviously have the circumstance with South Africa after apartheid. They went through and overhauled it. And if you ever want to look at something that is so amazing in the way it outlines individual rights, take a look at the South African Bill of Rights. There are at least 20 pages of nothing but specific rights that citizens have. And that obviously was a huge reaction because a good majority of the population was restricted of so many rights during that apartheid period. Adela?
What would it take for us to completely change our government system? Like
That's a great
voting in the government that we already have, or would somebody have to overthrow it?
That's a great question. I think it would have to be a circumstance where you would probably have, and this is one of the ways that you can amend the Constitution, is through like a state constitutional convention. It would have to take a circumstance like a convention of some kind to even preliminarily have the conversation of starting over, because it's a much different situation than the Articles of Confederation, which didn't give the government enough power. Someone would argue that we need to revamp the Constitution because it's so outdated, which is an argument that people bring up. You can find countless articles online that says the Articles of Confederation, or I'm sorry, the U.S. Constitution is an outdated document, it needs to go away. There's a lot of opinion articles that are out there, but it would take something of a drastic step that required each state to send representatives to a constitutional convention and take a vote to rewrite the document. I don't ever expect it to happen, but that it would be something that drastic, because you're talking about something that has been in place for so long. And, you know, you could argue that there's things that don't work in it and do work in it, but overall it's a pretty stable document in itself. So it would require a significant amount of convincing to get people on board to throw it out and start over. Frank?
But I mean, one of the the problem that I have a disagreement with, like what you said about requiring each state to have a constitutional convention, because like isn't one of the main reasons why people, besides of course that it's so old, why people don't like the Constitution is because it was written by a bunch of older, much older, um, rich, white, very privileged, for the most part, cisgendered, mostly straight men, um, who were all more or less able-bodied, and as a result, didn't really understand the struggles of people who weren't at like the very top tier of privilege. So, and that still happens, like not as majorly, but still, if we called the Constitutional Convention today and were required to send delegates, it would probably be for the most part a very similar demographic. So,
I think that's a good argument. I think that's a really good point that you bring up. The only thing I would say to that is that even though it's not at all completely resolved, the one thing that you have to remember is that a lot of the amendments that have been created over time were a step in the direction of kind of trying to resolve some of those differences or circumstances where people were disenfranchised. And I agree that it's not there yet. It's not even there. And I will tell you the one of the biggest arguments that people bring up against the document is that it doesn't provide enough specific rights to the citizens. And if you look through here, these are very vague, open-ended, up for interpretation statements about rights that you have. It's not, I mean, if we had more time in a normal circumstance, we could do a side-by-side comparison of this document to the Canadian Charters of Freedom or the South African Bill of Rights and just see some of the major differences that we see in terms of how specific it goes and how individually specific it breaks it down in terms of how people's rights are carried out and protected. That's one thing that a lot of people bring up. If you look for these articles about why, if you searched, the Constitution is outdated, you're going to find tons of opinion pieces that provide arguments of why this needs to be revised simply because of the fact that the document is not specific enough to protect the rights of people. And I think that's something that is still ongoing, obviously. Maya, did you have a question?
It was more adding on to what Frank said.
Go for it.
If you don't go through a thing, you shouldn't make laws regarding that thing. And that's part of why representation in the government is so important. And also, I'm just putting this out there, but a lot of times governments have been changed with riots, revolutions, and non-peaceful protests.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, our government was founded on a revolutionary process that acknowledged in the document that if the government's not protecting the rights of the citizens, then it has the right to alter or abolish it. So you make a good point there. Alex?
Well, I was thinking that one could argue that the amendments are so vague because it's up to the people to determine the integrity of the government by how they determine these amendments and how they determine the vagueness.
Well, and that's a good point. And it's always interesting when one of these amendments is referenced in a Supreme Court case on how the wording is to be interpreted, because, and this is why when you look at the Supreme Court and you look at the makeup of people in terms of their how they interpret the Constitution, it's one thing that if they are referencing the First Amendment or the Sixth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment or the 10th Amendment, how they're going to interpret it in its historical wording to a modern day example. It's a great question. Cassidy?
I feel like one of the downfalls of the Constitution being so vague is that it's basically all up to interpretation of who's in like the Supreme Court at that time. Currently, Amy Coney Barrett is up for the Supreme Court seat, and a lot of new people and like news sources are saying that gay marriage may be overturned, and it's in threat. So, which is I would say like a right of people getting married, And I feel like that's a downfall of the amendments because they are so vague.
Sure.
Certain rights, just because Supreme Court justices may be more, may have more different interpretations of the Constitution, that certain rights could be taken away.
No, that's a good point. And like I said, if you want to see a very interesting modern example, I would suggest you all take a look at the South African Bill of Rights. And one day, if we have time, we will, because I think it'll give you a good modern example. That dates from the early 1990s of just how different the circumstances were from this. And again, I'm not trying to throw this under the bus as a document, but it does have some shortfalls in terms of how you interpret it for sure. So, all right, the bell just rang, so I have to transition to my next course, but I'm going to go ahead and let you go. There is an exit ticket for today, please. It's a